Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be here today to share about delivering dignity, and give you all some what I hope to be some practical insights that you can apply and right after this call. I always want things to be used in a practical way for leaders. So I'm hopeful that this will serve as that for our time today. So, as was mentioned earlier, I'm Dr. Kirsten Brown Persley. This is a book that I've recently wrote. It was published a few months ago called Delivering Dignity, and it really serves as a comprehensive guide for leaders to cultivate cultural competence within their organizations. And so, a little bit of an introduction about me. So, outside of my career, I'm a wife, I'm a mom, I'm a mentor. And those things are really key to who I am as a person. And it's so interesting because as I was writing this book and doing a lot of the research on like what is dignity, what is cultural competence, and what does effective leadership look like, I really realized that what is true about my beliefs inside of my career also mirrors my life outside of my career. It just really becomes integral to who you are. And so, to give you a little bit of a background about me and from a career perspective, I was an educator in the urban core of Kansas City for over a decade. And that was just my life's passion. I was a founding school principal. During my time in school leadership, I founded two school concepts in Kansas City, Missouri, and led just an incredible team. And we served really diverse student population. And then I transitioned into nonprofit leadership, where I was an executive director of a nonprofit that really worked to ensure that there was greater diversity in the marketing and advertising industry in Kansas City, and also supporting businesses, corporations, ad agencies, and make sure that there was sort of this idea of like cultural competence so that we could help them kind of get talent of color within the space, but how are they ensuring that there is sufficient points of cultural competence there for retention? And that really led me on this path to becoming a strategic advisor, where I began just kind of, I wasn't even seeking this out. I would have people come up to me and ask for support with cultivating cultural competence in their organizations. And a lot of my doctoral research related to this. And so, after doing trainings and a lot of coaching work with my clients around cultural competence, I was begged many times to write a book and decided, you know what, I have a lot of proof of concept for the desire for a book around these topics. And so that's what we're going to be talking today is the content of my book, Delivering Dignity. So I think it's really important when we talk about this idea of dignity. We have a common language, and there's a clear definition for what dignity actually is, and that we are normed on this word, so that as we're discussing it, it's we're all kind of on the same page. So really, the definition used in the book and the definition that I've adopted is the quality or state of being worthy, honored, or esteemed. And this is really kind of the central idea of the book is that is really what we should strive, especially as leaders, whether it's your leader in your home, leader in the workplace, wherever you show up as a leader, it's really critical to make sure that you are being intentional about cultivating a sense of dignity within those that you interact with. So, and that they have a sense of being honored and esteemed and feel worthy by you, by how you treat them. And so we're going to dive into that today in more detail. And one thing I just want to say related to this is, when one commits to delivering dignity, it's really distilled down to making sure that the people that you lead and that you interact with, that they're deeply understood and affirmed. And so when this happens, when you build relationships, when you deeply seek to understand those that you lead and those with whom you work, you can better affirm them in a way that is most authentic to them and the way that makes them feel dignified. And when that happens, you're better able to understand what are their areas of expertise that they're bringing to the table. What are their different points of perspective that maybe they can provide when you're considering a problem for your organization? They can help you solve it. When you really understand the people you lead and with whom you work, you can leverage their expertise. You can leverage their unique perspective to drive radical results. And that's something my research showed me time and time again as I was writing this book and also doing my doctoral work around effective leadership. Leaders who affirm and seek to better understand the expertise people have, the perspectives they can bring to the table, and that really creates radical results for organizational leaders. Time and time again, if organizational leaders are like implementing this with intentionality, their results and productivity, the way that their team is able to get to the goals set forth, is driven into overdrive because of intentionality around delivering dignity. And so really I see it as it's a charge of leaders. However you show up as a leader, it is your responsibility to deliver dignity to all who work within the organization. It doesn't matter if you're like leading them, they're under you in terms of an organization chart, if they're lateral leaders or if they're above you. Really what I find too is the healthiest organizational cultures are those where there's a commitment to delivering dignity at every level, and people want to stay within that organization. They persist, they feel excited about the work, and they make sure that they're all rowing in the same direction to get the impact that they desire for the organization. And this is just so critical and transformational. And it's not rocket science, but it's something that we must be intentional about implementing. So one thing that, we talked about kind of laid the foundation for what dignity looks like in the workplace and why it's important. I want to talk to you about something that I often see with the clients I work with, and frankly, I've experienced in my own points of experience professionally. And it's an idea of something that I talk quite extensively in the book called a dignity breach. And it's so funny because I often talk about dignity breaches in my talks, and afterwards, I'll be kind of, chopping it up with some of the folks who are in the audience, and someone will make a joke that's offensive and like, oh my gosh, that's a dignity breach. And I'm like, I love it. I love when people are like applying the language from the book to make sure that we're living this out and we're being intentional about this work. So kind of as a segue, what I'll say about dignity breaches, it's when you do something that intentionally or unintentionally breaches the dignity or chips away at the dignity of others. And so oftentimes when I see this, leaders don't want to create dignity breaches, but it does happen because they lack the intentionality of delivering dignity with those that they work with. So we're going to talk a little bit about this with some examples in terms of a crucible moment. And so one thing that is really critical, and you'll see this in a little bit as we go deeper into the content, I'm going to share with you here in a bit a framework called the Dignity Framework, which is a research-based framework that's really central to the book that really serves as a guide for leaders to kind of check themselves to make sure that they're delivering dignity. And within that, the heart of this framework is this idea of relationships and knowing people and really being intentional about like delivering that dignity. And so I'm going to share a crucible moment of mine where, it's a school age example. So I was in high school during this example, but I'm going to also kind of illustrate after I tell the story how it can apply to a workplace situation. So I remember when I was a freshman in high school, I had a best friend, and she was a white student, and we were both on the cheerleading squad. We both had the same grade in our English class, and we're just so invested in the class. And we always sat near the front, and we're always doing our work together and pushing each other to excel academically. And I remember at the end of my freshman year, we had to go to our teacher, and the teacher actually signed off on a piece of paper to let us know what class we were going to be recommended for to take for our sophomore year. And so my friend, she went up to her teacher, and she was recommended to take the advanced English class. And she came back so excited and showed me her paper. And I was so excited for her, but also thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to be in the same English class again. Like we both have the same grade. We're both have such a zeal for learning. I cannot wait to get signed off for that too. So I went to my teacher and had my little conference, my little 2-minute conference about what was going to happen next year. And I saw my paper that she recommended me for the regular English class. It wasn't the advanced one. It's kind of like, why is that? Like Kelsey and I, my friend, we have the same grade. We're both really invested in school. We're both like, athletes. I don't know why I wasn't provided the opportunity to take the more rigorous course opportunity. And so I kind of went back to my seat and I asked my friend, I said, "Hey, did you ask to be in that advanced class? Like, how did that happen?" She goes, "No, she just signed me up for that." Like, oh man, like she was like, "You're taking it, right?" I'm like, "No, I'm not. I didn't get recommended." And so I sat on that and was just quite unsettled. And so I then went up to my teacher and said, "Hey, I see that my friend got into the advanced class. We have the same grade. I'd really love the opportunity to take a more rigorous course of study as well." And my teacher looked shocked, like she was flabbergasted. She's like, "Wait, you want to take the advanced class?" I said, "Yes, I would love to take the advanced class." And she goes, "Oh, okay, I'll sign you up for it." And so I signed up for that. I got into that class. And I didn't realize that at the time, but that was so pivotal because I was now on that advanced class, that advanced trajectory for English. I went on to be an English teacher. I went on to write a book. Like it was because of the more rigorous course of study that really prepared me to like live into all that I think I was created to do. And so I always point out that moment. And I think that's really a powerful illustration, not only for educators, but really in the workplace. How many times do we let biases about what people can or cannot do limit what we push them to doing and they don't reach their full potential? And so in that moment, my teacher did not mean to create a dignity breach. I know her heart. That was not her intention. However, she still did. It still did not allow me to feel affirmed or esteemed, especially knowing that my friend, the only difference is our race, she was given opportunity and I wasn't. And so I just really learned like I need to advocate for myself. And more importantly, if I ever have a position to kind of tell the story, I really want to push leaders to think about like how do we dignify others? And one way we do that is seeing the best in them and seeing what's possible and what they're capable of doing. And we don't sell them short. That's a really critical element. And that's a piece of an example of a dignity breach that I wanted to lift up. And so, in my book, I have more dignity breaches, and I also invite others to think about their dignity breaches. And so, I want to like take a moment for folks who are on this call to think about times where you've had a dignity breach. And so, mine was specific to school, mine was specific to maybe something racial happening, but we all have had dignity breaches in somewhere in our life for one reason or another. And I want us to take a moment to think about that because as a leader who's dignity centered, we must consistently think about those dignity breaches as a way to fuel empathy within us so that we're less likely to perpetuate those. So, previously, I discussed the dignity framework. And so, at the core is dignity and relationships. You can best provide dignity in a way that someone wants to receive it, the way that someone is most dignified by having a relationship. Like for me, I feel really dignified when someone takes the time to talk to me, understand me, ask questions. For my husband, he feels most dignified in other ways. For example, he likes when people kind of gives him the cliffs notes and keeps it moving. But you only know that because you're responsive and can be responsive to that if you have a relationship and you get to know them and understand what really resonates with that person from like the way that they feel most dignified. And there are some critical elements that help create and codify this idea of dignity-centered leadership. One is diversity. And so it's really, really critical to think about as a leader the different ways that people are showing up, the different experiences, the different cultures, the different lenses and points of perspective and diversity of thought. All of those things are really critical to be cognizant of so that you can best understand how they want to be dignified in the way that they show up and the way that they want to show up based on those different elements. Also, empathy is so critical. We kind of talked about that earlier with the dignity breach. You have to have a sense of empathy in order to have a heightened awareness into ways that you may unintentionally be causing dignity breaches. And you're more rooted and centered on delivering dignity when you have empathy and when that's top of mind. And you're putting yourself in terms of thinking not how you want to be treated, but how those you work with want to be treated. I always say the golden rule is fine, but I'm really about the platinum rule because the platinum rule is not the golden rule, of course, we know is treat others the way you want to be treated. But I want to go make it a little bit different and say the platinum rule is treat others the way they want to be treated. So you may not be want to be treated the same way that your neighbor does, but you can only figure out how your neighbor wants to be treated if you have that relationship and you get to know them and you understand how they really want to be treated by you, especially if you're leading them. And so one way that's to help kind of cultivate that relationship and understand ways they feel want to feel dignified is by having vulnerability. You got to be real with people because that helps build trust. And then when you're authentic with people, that's going to help strengthen relationships. That's going to help build that dignity that is so critical for not only for people to feel like they belong, which is the next point, but also for them to want to persist and row in the same boat that you're rowing in to meet the mission of the organization. And so I'm going to say this thing about belonging again, because I kind of did a quick second on it, but belonging is really, really important because a lot of time, yes, you need to have inclusion, but belonging is like inclusion plus. It's like if you have inclusion, it's like you have all the people in your organization that you may be leading, you may include them in the meeting, but to have them belong, you may say, so what are your thoughts? What are your perspective? You let them know that they're esteemed and they're affirmed and what they have to say matters. And you don't just say it, you don't just ask them just to kind of check off a box, but it's because you genuinely want to understand and you want to see if maybe they have something to share that could be really insightful and helpful for where you're trying to go with the organization. So, organizations that do a good job of creating a sense of belonging, that people feel safe and they know that they're cared for in the organization and that their perspective matters, leaders are able to hear their authentic thoughts. They're able to give authentic feedback and pushback that is healthy, that allows for the organization to move forward in a way that would not be true if people did not have that psychological safety, if they did not feel like they belonged. And when you have people who belong, they feel psychologically safe, they outperform those who don't have a sense of belonging, like head and shoulders far and beyond. And so that I cannot um, underscore enough the importance of a sense of belonging and how if you're dignifying others, you're building relationships, you're making sure there's a sense of belonging, they're going to help really drive the organization forward. And with that is cultural competence. One thing that I see a lot in my coaching and in my training is that people sometimes have these other pieces we just talked about. They have them in place and are really strong, but they often engage in dignity breaches because they say something that's culturally lacks cultural competence. And that actually chips away at trust because they're not getting to know the people that they're working with. And they make assumptions or they say things that aren't appropriate because they're actually not building the relationships. And you keep hearing me say relationships as a key. All of these points go back to relationships. All of these key, in order to build dignity, you have to have authentic, genuine relationships that you continue to cultivate. And that provides more equitable workplaces. When we talk about this idea of equity, it's giving each person what they need. And so, this is another dignity breach I see quite a bit within my clients. They'll have these blanket type of expectations or kind of supports in place, but they don't tier it based on what people need. So, to give an example of this, um, I was coaching a client in North Carolina, and they were really, really struggling to, support some of their team members to really meet the expectations they set forth. And so they were like, really, they were lowering the bar for some team members, which is never, should never happen. Like the expectation should never change. But what should change is the amount of support you give them. And so, what one person's support looks like may differ. And so this particular leader was making everyone go to all of these trainings, even though they didn't need it. There were some people who are like, they could actually do the training. They didn't actually need to sit in yet another training, but they just did this blanket response for everyone. That's actually not equitable. What's equitable is giving people what they need, and it varies based on what the reality of the situation is. And so, what actually we talked about is hey, instead of like frankly wasting people's time who could actually be more productive, like leaning into where they actually need to grow. Let's create a differentiated approach where those who need the training can get the training they need and they can upskill and get better and meet the high bar we have for everyone. Well, those who don't necessarily need that training, instead, they can work on something else to improve. So everyone's getting better. We're elevating for everyone. And that's really at the heart of dignity. And that's what we want. We want everyone to be their best. We want to support them because we see their potential. And that is something that leaders in my research, leaders who do that well and recognize that, like really, really, really make sure, like have in really in high levels of employee engagement, satisfaction, and performance. So that is the dignity framework. These components really should serve as a gut check for leaders. How am I doing with these various components? Are relationship centered? What is the fruit of those dignity centered relationships? It should be equity, it should be empathy, vulnerability, belonging. You should be assessing the fruit of that to make sure you're really living into this idea of dignity centered leadership. So, I've already talked about all these points, so I'm not going to go into it, but I do want to. I love talking about my little daughter. Her name's Penelope. She's 2. And for me, she's such a great example of inclusion. I'm going to tell you why. So, this is me and my husband looking at our daughter Penny. We call her Penny for short. And she does this thing where whenever someone is kind of on the sidelines, she will grab their hand and draw them to bring them along. And so that's like what
That's
dignity
great.
centered leaders do, right? They don't just like allow you to flounder or just kind of watch from the sidelines. They bring you in because it's better when we're all together. And so I talk about this story in my book. One time, my parents were visiting me and she wanted to run back and forth on the first floor. She was going back and forth, back and forth. And so, she noticed like, hey, I'm not having as much fun. It's not as engaging by myself. So she took everyone's hand, my hand, my husband's hand, both my parents' hand, and said, now let's run. And she had us run back and forth with her. And it was just the most fun, joy filled experience versus her doing it herself. And even if like someone got winded, she would wait. She would go check in on them and say, are you okay? She'd give them some time and she'd come back and she'd grab their hand and support them. Like for me, that's just such a simple example, but it's a beautiful example of like what dignity centered leadership does. You care. And that care is clear. That dignity is clear. You want everyone to be along with you to drive the change forward. And that's what effective organizational leaders do. So, this idea of cultivating cultural competence, this is like the part where people get the most stuck. And I spend the most of my book really unpacking and unraveling what this means. And so one thing that I talk about a lot is this idea of socio-cultural competence. And this is a review that leaders can go through to really kind of serve as a gut check. Am I serving those I lead well by living into the cultivating cultural competence part of the framework? And so you can ask questions like, what biases do I have? And really take time to think about this because everyone has biases. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, but what's not okay is to not recognize your biases and not do anything about it. And so it's really important that you're having this gut check and you're doing this consistently because biases can evolve over time, right? So, like a bias that you have today may not be the same bias or biases that you have 6 months from now. So it's really critical to engage in that constant introspection. Also identify like, why do I have these biases? It's a lot easier to kind of contend and figure out how to combat these points of biases you may have if you understand the root cause. Was there an experience or a moment that caused that? Understanding kind of the root cause will help you better move forward. And think about like points of discrimination. Like there could be points of discrimination you may have like unintentionally and we all have them, right? But just you have to understand like how is that showing up right now as I exist currently as a leader? And what is the impact, potential or actual impact of these biases or points of discrimination? Again, that helps build that empathy so you're not perpetuating these dignity breaches. So that's something that's really, really critical to continue to do that self examination, engaging in the socio cultural competence review. We talked about this a bit too. Vulnerability and empathy, just such critical levers for effective leaders. And so a lot of the leaders I coach, they think that they're vulnerable and they think that they're empathetic, But then we actually talk to people. We do a kind of an equity review and a cultural competence review, and a lot of people may not say that that's the truth. And there's usually clear trends of behaviors that are across the organization that need to be identified, that serve as a mirror for folks to be more aware of ways that they're creating a culture that is steeped in dignity breaches. And so I think it's really important for leaders to make sure that they're getting truthful responses from those they lead, those above them and those laterally, to understand where are they falling short in this, because that could really be an element that could stymie or stall progress for the organization. And of course, one way to do that is honest two-way feedback. You can give feedback and you can receive feedback. But again, I've coached leaders who sometimes can give feedback, but to receive it, it's really hard for them. And so if you're actually not, if you have shown folks that you lead that you actually aren't good at receiving feedback, you're probably not going to get like authentic feedback, and that's not actually going to help you. So that's why having those reviews where people can anonymously provide feedback is going to be really important. So it serves as a temperature check on how effective you are of creating that psychological safety for people to be honest. And in the absence of honesty in leadership, where people feel safe to be honest, that stalls progress, because someone could see a big issue coming down the road, but they may not feel safe to tell you. And so if that happens, that just creates a huge headache for the leader. And I've seen that happen. So it's really important to like be proactive in cultivating of a culture where people feel safe, because you've built those authentic relationships and people know that you can receive and give that effective feedback. And you got to know yourself. So if you know that you're struggling with this, you have to be really intentional about kind of reversing course. The biggest thing that I see where leaders have stalled progress is when they don't truly know themselves, or they say things that aren't actually true about the reality. Like, oh yeah, I'm really great at receiving feedback. I'm really great at building relationships. But the evidence or the fruit of that is not clear. And so really be honest with yourself, because if you're not honest, you can't actually move forward and improve. And if you're not improving, especially if this is a critical area where improvement is needed, the whole organization will be held back because of that. All right, said a lot. Let's move this from conceptual to actionable. So I have some questions. I'm just going to pause, let you read them, and have these points to ponder on in terms of things that are actionable that you can do as a leader in your reflection to hold yourself accountable to some of the points we discussed. I'll leave about 45 seconds. And if folks have reflections or things, please come off mute, add it in the chat, and then we'll move on.
I think part of it really is just, excuse me, keeping the focus on an awareness in your mind, because I mean, in your mind's eye, you have all these things. When you meet someone for the first time, you have this flood of the way you were raised, your environment you've been in, the way that they appear, that all these biases that come in. And I think taking a new approach to, letting those go to the wayside and really get to know the person and all these points that you've been talking about is going to be absolutely key.
Yes, Julie, like so beautifully said. Thank you.
Well,
Any other thoughts? All right. So I'm going to leave you off with a call to action. This just is, it's not just a book I wrote or something I do as a career. It's really something that I believe is critical for our world. I think about all the civil discourse that we're having and how unproductive it is because we don't center on dignity, and just how polarized we are in our society. And I wonder what could happen if we started to center more on dignity. And so I really believe this is more than just something that we can aspire to do, but something we should actually act on and make a reality. And knowing that this is a personal journey for all of us, but we're all personally accountable for our organization's culture and the impact of the culture we want to create and permit. So, with this in mind, I would like you to kind of reflect on what are you going to do differently, or recommit to doing, or just continue to keep at top of mind from hearing about this, and think about what is your personal call to action as a result of our time today. I would love if if everyone could either put it in the chat or come off mute to share that. Just because if we could write it down or say it aloud, it just has that much more power to make sure that it's not something that we think about, but something we do.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I think it's personally important for everybody to understand that we have all grown up with biases that we have seen either in the news, social media, friends. And when you become leaders, like you said, we have to understand that we have inherent bias. Everybody does. The way you talked about that is we have to be held accountable to understanding what they are and overcoming them. And I thought that was, for me, it just reaffirms what I do every day to make sure that we aren't going down that rabbit hole of just sticking our head in the sand and letting things go, and being able to have open and honest dialogue with situations and people that you may not like what they have to hear. I find it's easier to do that with friends that you know their heart than it is with people at work, because when you're in a position of leadership, it's kind of hard to have those open and trustworthy conversations.
Jeremy, how do you navigate having those open and trustworthy conversations in the workplace specifically?
Ooh. When it comes to first off, I have a pretty diverse work group, so I generally try to make sure we include everybody in conversations. But for my own personal bias, like I try to have those conversations with friends that know my heart and know that we can have open communication that aren't going to affect my career.
Mm,
Because one wrong, in a position of leadership, you make one wrong statement, it could cost you your job.
that's good.
And so, I can't put my family in a position to say, hey, I want to have an open and honest dialogue about, racism or cultural divide or all that with people at work, because they're not here for that.
Mm.
They're here for me to be the best leader I can be and for them to be the best version of themselves they can be. But I can have those conversations with friends, and we can have some tough conversations and understanding to be better people and to see the other side that we may not understand.
Good. Jeremy, one thing first of all, just really appreciate your vulnerability and sharing that insight and your perspective. And that's really important. I just think that the more we can have open dialogue during this time, the better we can all just like learn from each other. One thing I want, perhaps point of consideration for you is having like shying away from those real talk conversations um, could actually create a situation where people aren't feeling safe because they're like, oh, but they never talk about things that are really like clearly affecting the people within this organization. And so it may be something to consider to bring someone like a facilitator or someone to help engage in conversations if it's becoming an issue in the workplace, if it's something that keeps rising up as something that is a topic that folks are wanting to engage in. So I think that especially if you're noticing people are, it's top of mind and folks want to engage with it, especially if it pertains to the work that's being done. It's always a good idea not to shy away from it, but to engage in it. But to your point, you want to be thoughtful. And if you're like, hey, I don't have all the language and ways to say it where it doesn't, cause an issue, always thinking about bringing in someone from the outside to help who has expertise in that area is always a point of consideration for any issue that you may be navigating.
No, I agree totally. And we're pretty lucky. We have a very diverse leadership staff and workforce here. So, and we do have
Right.
people here that we trust, and I trust that we can have, when they see things coming up, we can have open conversation. I'm talking about the deep core conversations that you want to have, but you really can't have at work, to get, to have better understanding.
Mhm. Okay, that makes sense. So, Jeremy, it's like kind of almost like you have like kind of your circle of friends where you try to like make meaning with and try to understand issues before engaging outside, but maybe people in work, kind of like a safe space to grapple and better understand is kind of what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, I'm a white male in Missouri, but I also grew up in Decatur, Georgia, so I understand it all. But things change as things change. Having those open dialogues are important, and I think a lot of leaders, number one, have a lot of friends that look and act like them. And
Mhm.
so it's struggled to get a different perspective. So it's important to have people in your life that have different perspectives than you do.
That's good. Thank you, Jeremy.
So, Kirsten, one quick comment that I want to make is it was interesting that you mentioned that you're an English major. And I think that's really evident because I love the way that you use language to communicate. The term dignity breach is a new one for me. And I really like the way that you've used positive language to talk about concepts that can be difficult and they're often labeled in ways that are alienating rather than engaging. So thank you for that.
No, thank you, Kent.
Hey, Kirsten, I'm kind of sitting at this at a both and like place where, as you know, I work directly with interns and young people and I supervise them. So in a lot of ways, I feel like responsible for being that leader that I need to be to model for them what it looks like to be a good leader in many ways. And then also ensuring that when they hit that place, they know how to lead, but also they know what to look for in a leader. And then the both and sitting kind of in a very middle ground place where then I also report to a number of people as well. So, which can be tough because I think when you hear really great talks like this, you sometimes can sit here and wish like, oh, I wish like my higher ups were on this call and that they got like they had access to this information right now. But I think the best that I can do is lead with my like interns in the way in which I want to be led, which I think maybe circles back to that platinum role that you mentioned. So yeah, that's just sort of what I'm taking away is that there may not feel like anything actionable that I can do above my head, but by me doing what like I can for those that I oversee, that I supervise, that's currently like the best place that I can practice that and also essentially model it. Hopefully somebody above me will see the way in which I engage with the young people that we serve. So, yeah.
Akia, I appreciate you sharing that. And Akia, I want to give you a shout out. So I think, so I had the privilege of leading Akia, and she is such an incredible, when I think about dignity-centered leadership, she does a great job of modeling this and embodying this. And I think one thing that was really impactful for me as a leader, Akia, is the way you manage up. And I think that's really important. So to your point, not only modeling this, but you do a really effective job of providing that effective feedback, that two-way feedback. So I knew I could come to you and give you feedback and it would be received and we can engage in a really productive dialogue that would result in the change that we both could identify. And the same for me. Like if I was not centering on dignity, especially for those we served in the nonprofit space, you were really good about naming it and being so clear about the impact. And so I just want to applaud you for the way you model dignity-centered leadership and the way you manage up to ensure that everyone is, even those that are your leaders, are committing to living that out. So I just want to encourage you to keep doing that. And even if you don't feel like there's traction, know that the impact of your work is eventually going to pay off and people do recognize that. So I want to provide that kudos to you, Akia.
Thanks, Kirsten. I would just say for everyone on this call, Kirsten is literally the most incredible leader. This whole entire book, as somebody that can just back up it, she is my leader up until a year ago, and I would say I've never learned so much like about the way in which I want to lead until I was managed by Kirsten, supervised by Kirsten. So yeah, I will just attest to her as a fantastic leader.
Thank
Well,
you so
what a
much.
tribute. And it's moments like this that make me regret a 47-minute webinar because we're right on the threshold. Kirsten, what's a good way that people can connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's my information. Would love to connect with folks.
Can I ask one quick question?
Sure.
Julie.
So I volunteer for 2 different organizations. One of them works with children who have been through a lot of trauma, and the other one works with women that have been through a lot of trauma. Is there anything additional that you would recommend for those folks that I need to be thinking of and kind of work in with all of this that you're talking about?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So a lot of the work, especially early in my career, I did a lot of work with trauma-informed care. And so the biggest thing is when I was actually writing this, I was thinking about how could this message resonate with a myriad of audiences, like leaders who are in various spaces, including those who are in areas where there needs to be additional thoughtfulness around trauma-informed points of operating as a leader. And so I think the same things are true. Just centering on dignity, having those relationships built, and just being really cognizant of treating people the way they want to be treated and getting to know them so that you're not overstepping. In my experience, when I've overstepped because I wanted to move quickly in a relationship and I wasn't treating the person the way they clearly were showing me they wanted to be treated, that's when I got into the most trouble. So that's why I was so intentional about putting the platinum rule in there, because I think it just, no matter what, whoever you're leading or serving, that's always going to be something to that'll help kind of be a guidepost to keep you in line.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Well, man, thank you so much for sharing this, giving us your contact info. So I know a lot of people want to be able to follow up and take it even further. Here's a few things coming up that we want to highlight before we log off. We do have an Asking Academy coming up next week. You probably can't make it if you're wanting to bring a team, but we have Asking Academy Classic in June and another one in October. So if you want to bring some dignity to your donors, specifically major donors, we would love to talk to you about bringing a team. Information there at askingacademy.com. And then next month's 47-minute webinar, Tammy Zonker is going to be sharing with us capturing donor attention before, during, and after a presidential election. So I know a lot of you in the fundraising space are wondering, okay, what do I need to do for this election season? So Tammy will help us navigate through those waters, and we're excited for what she'll be bringing to the table. But let me say to everyone, thank you for logging on, and especially Kirsten, thanks for taking the time to join us and share. A very quick recap. Again, if you haven't got the book, you need to get it. You need to read it. I highlighted some stuff that I was hoping to get to share on the call, but we're out of time. So
Hey, before you go though,
yourself.
Yeah, before we go, everybody join me in congratulating our latest gold medal winner from the, what was that, Aaron, World Jiu-Jitsu Championship in Long Beach, California last week.
Something like that. Yeah.
Anyhow, congratulations.
Congratulations.
And great big huge thank you again, Kirsten. Excellent content, beautiful delivery. Great to spend some more time with you today. Thanks so much.
All right,
Thank
bye
you.
everybody.